The title has been slightly edited, or shall we say revised, since I gave in the original one. So my title today is Culture from the Outside In, and I'll explain what that means, from human culture to human cultures to intercultural competence. Thank you, Beatrice, for the introduction. I wanted to add just a little bit. Can you hear me? Kind of, sort of? How about this? Oh. Okay. So I wanted to introduce myself a little more so that you know who's talking to you. I think I'm an interesting choice to address this conference, or maybe an interesting choice. I study culture mostly theoretically and empirically rather than pedagogically. So that's why my title is Culture from the Outside In. I'm sort of making the assumption that I'm coming here as an outsider to some degree, and then sort of working my way from theory and top down or outside into the concept of intercultural competence, which I'll get to at the end of my talk, but I hope what I'm saying has some relevance. It will be theoretical. Prepare yourself, including if a pillow is what you need at this time of evening for my talk. So I look at, in my work, I look at these kinds of questions, okay? I look at what is culture as a conceptual tool for studying people, especially second language learners. Where does the concept come from, historically speaking? How has it been studied? What's wrong with it? Very important. And how does it relate to the concept of identity? And finally, the effect of globalization on the ways we use this concept in the 21st century. I'd also like to add that, as Beatrice mentioned, my 12 years of living in Japan and working in Japan has colored my view of culture, and also the fact that I'm a second language educator, a former ESL teacher who now teaches teachers of ESL. And I'd like to begin historically, for the reason I believe that without the history, without understanding how a concept has been made, what Bruno Latour calls in the making, he talks about science in the making, we don't really know what it's good for. We don't really know what we can use it for as a tool. So let's begin then historically. So concepts of culture were, of course, invented and designed and developed to explain human difference. That's certainly what the original social science concept of culture is developed in the 20th century by Franz Boas and his students from German roots was. It was a tool for describing how and why people differed. So Boas's contemporary, and I must say I'm a Boasian, whatever that is, as you'll see, but Boas's contemporaries said that cultures differ because they differ in their race and cognitive development. That people, number one, typically almost always white Europeans, were so civilized and successful because they were biologically and cognitively predestined to do so, okay? People, number two, on the other hand, had smaller brains, very important, less sophisticated languages, little industrial technology, and therefore lesser ability to dominate their natural environments. They were in a state of semi-animal nature, whereas people one were fully civilized, fully human. How many of you are familiar with this history? I just want to know a little bit of who I'm talking to. Okay. So Boas and his associates came along and they turned the picture upside down, or we could say inside out. They argued that cultural and even developmental differences had little to do with biology, and that Boas himself spent much of his life showing how the so-called natives had all the supposed hallmarks of civilization, including history, art, religion, sophisticated languages, technology, moral systems, and the sort of ineffable characteristic of Herzbildung, that is, the cultivation of the heart. So from this work by Boas and his students, two pictures emerged, okay? And two pictures which have really massively influenced our understanding in the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century of human beings, okay? So first, the first idea, was that cultures are not biologically based, they're socially constructed. This is the idea we know well. They're constructed out of social values, social practices, and social identities. So culture, number one, and this was a key ingredient, really, in Boas' original thinking, developed its values and practices not from scratch, but from cultures 2, 3, and 4, the tribes that were located across the river or over the mountains. That is, a culture's technology and religious practices and narratives were by no means original. Rather, they were radically diffused and impure, okay? If you want a postmodern concept of culture, as some of you have been talking about in your presentations in this conference, I'd say this is a pretty good one. It's not the original culture concept that we sometimes think. So the influences, the materials of which a culture is made are borrowed from anywhere else except that original culture. What the culture did, though, was they wove them together in distinct ways and gave them distinctive emotional resonances, what Raymond Williams calls structures of feeling. So Boas's own view of culture was quite different from his later students' view, the one which became the classical anthropological notion, I believe, perhaps, his later students being Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead especially. So it was not, his original view was not a picture of discrete value systems and practices. In fact, in the words of his early doctoral student, culture was that planless hodgepodge, that thing of shreds and patches. So that's the first picture, the first main influence of the Boasian tradition. The second was that of the biological and psychic unity of humankind. The idea here being one that I think we would all accept today, and I would say because of Franz Boas, okay, that we're not all exactly the same. We're not all motivated by the same, but we're not all exactly the same, but we're motivated by the same basic needs, the same basic impulses, and the same basic aspirations. This is Herzbildung again, okay? We're all in this together. You know this story, university and diversity, okay? Unity and diversity, sorry. So later anthropologists like Clifford Geertz even said that we are in fact united by our diversity. That is, we all have a common and strong human impulse is to claim a distinctive group identity, to differentiate ourselves from the people across the river or over the hill. So it's the second picture of the biological and psychic unity of humankind that I want to start with today in developing my own thoughts, my own understanding of culture. So not the idea of human cultures that we're probably primarily interested in here, but of one single common human culture. Again, I realize this may be turning the concept upside down or inside out as we understand it when we talk about intercultural competence, but let me use it at least as a starting point. Let me have a drink. It's not alcoholic yet. It will be in 30 or 45 minutes. Okay. So from the 19th to the mid-20th century, okay, it was commonly thought in the West that humans from different parts of the world were fundamentally different. And difference, as usual, equated with deficiency, as we know. The human races, it was believed, could be graded on a scale of simple to complex, or primitive to advanced, or civilized, uncivilized to civilized on a purely biological basis. This, of course, was the same ideology that underwrote slavery, racism, apartheid, white supremacy, scientific racism, and the ultimate expression of all of these, Nazism. Yet, it was a dominant way of looking at human beings in the 19th century. So we get great people like Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, arguing for the natural superiority of the white race. 5 years before his speech at Gettysburg, Lincoln said, "There's a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid them from living together on terms of social and political equality. And as they cannot so live, they must be in a position of inferior and superior. And I, as much as any man," he says, "am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." So I'm not trying to diss Abraham Lincoln. I'm just trying to say, this was a very common way of thinking in this period of time. And onto the scene, into this toxic environment, came the Berlin School of Ethnology that Franz Boas emerged from. And the Berlin School argued basically that since biological differences across races, non-trivial biological differences, had not been, established empirically, that the null hypothesis was a better option, okay, that there are no basic biological differences. And they set about measuring skulls and skeletons in a truly, well, here's my stereotype, Germanic way. It's not just a stereotype, though, I think. Rudolf Virchow, one of the great biologists of the 19th century, had labs upon labs, museums upon museums of skeletons. And in doing so, they became pioneers in physical anthropology, and their purpose was to show the deep physical differences among different races of human beings were trivial, that they really didn't have any meaning in the larger scope of things. And this was the soil which Franz Boas emerged from and which he cultivated. So human nature didn't depend on what race you were from or where you were from. We were all fundamentally human. On this basis, cultures could be studied. Culture explained the differences between us, including both adaptations to our physical environments, our different physical environments, and the unique interpretations and understandings different peoples put on their experience. So both of these kinds of difference were crystallized in the principle of cultural relativism, that all cultures were created equal. So here's the first point I'd like to make, okay? The notion of culture, and the one that I think we understand most widely today, is a comparative and contrastive one, okay? Culture A contrasts with culture B. But human difference only makes sense from this viewpoint, Boasian viewpoint, against a background of human commonality, okay? Cultural difference is relative, human commonality is absolute. And I'll talk about some implications of this view in a moment for human learning. So current versions of the biological and psychic unity of humankind are somewhat different than the traditional Boasian approach. Here's my own partial summary, okay? From day one, about 1.8 million years ago, human beings evolved unique and specialized capacities for interacting with their non-human and human environments. Capacities which enabled extremely high levels of environmental alignment. First, we use tools to radically operate on our physical environment, hammers and saws and axes, for instance, chop down trees and to turn them into building materials, or telephones and computers to communicate over vast distances. Second, we have highly evolved capacities, and these are unique to humans, for interaction and cooperation, theory of mind, turn-taking, gesture, gaze, repair, for instance, are all capacities that predate the development of human language and on which human language is based, okay? Human language, our interactional tool of tools. Third, utilizing our environmental tool-using abilities and our interactional tool-using abilities, we engage in actively and obsessively reconfiguring our physical environment and our human environment, our lived environment, through what biologists call niche construction. So much so that there's hardly anything natural left in the world at all, in a sense, okay? If you doubt this for any reason, I'd simply say, look around this room and tell me what's natural, what hasn't been touched or made or conditioned by the human hand. A final evolved human capacity is perhaps the most relevant for us here today. That is, compared to the rest of the animal kingdom, we are simply breathtaking learners. In the words of evolutionary historian Yuval Harari, most mammals emerge from the womb like glazed earthenware, emerging from the kiln. Any attempt at remolding will only scratch and break them. Human beings, on the other hand, emerge from the womb like molten glass from a furnace. They can be spun, stretched, and shaped with a surprising degree of freedom. That's why today we can educate children to become Christian or Buddhist, capitalist or socialist, warlike or loving, and I would add French or English or Spanish or Chinese or Tagalog speaking, or all of them basically at the same time. So human beings are therefore the world's champion interactors, reconstructors, and learners. These differences distinguish us from our animal kin. They're thus the things that bring us together, that make us all fundamentally human. They're also, and here's a strong implication for teaching and learning in the sense that it makes them possible in the first place, the common ground, this common human culture based on interaction, reconstruction, and learning are what make learning and teaching possible in the first place, the common ground on which all human behavior occurs. In and outside our classrooms, we assume these common human capacities without which we wouldn't be able to teach and learn. So this is a different way of thinking about culture. We're talking about one common human culture and its implications for what we do in the classroom and in any case of learning or teaching. So let's consider the case of gesture, okay? One of these unique human interactional abilities I mentioned, and one of the types of cultural material we can teach in the classroom, okay? What do we know about gesture? We know that everyone in the world understands the use of gesture, that we all mark our moment-to-moment relations with the world with our hands, okay? That's something nobody has to teach us, nobody has to figure out. We also know that some gestures, at least, have universal meaning. Pointing, for instance, is universally referential. And we also know that there are some gestures that don't have universal meaning, but whose meaning is not totally random either. So if in Japan I do this to you, I'm not sure if you know this gesture, but what do you think I'm doing? What kind of meaning am I making? Come, okay. Now how did you know that? Yeah, it has something to do with this axis of, invitation or whatever, go away, right? In my American American context, I can go like this. So the gesture doesn't just come from culture, it's more universal. So let me say a little more about gesture as an example of our common human heritage, but also as a culturally evolved learning tool, okay? So gestures are apparently universal enough to serve as strong, if partial, tools for language learning. It's been found, for instance, that students at least sometimes gesture correct answers to language teachers' questions, a correct vocabulary word, for example, before they can say them, okay? They even sometimes indicate the correct answer through gesture and then give the wrong answer in speech, okay? So gesture, as part of our unique human capacity for complex visual semiotics, is therefore a valuable tool of universal human culture by which we learn. And I don't think what I'm trying to say here is that this is not something we usually think about or consider, but that sometimes in our rush to find cultural difference, we may not think, perhaps I would say, enough about how these differences are based on a common repertoire of human behavior that we all share, which I'll argue later on is in fact cultural itself, okay? Now, for some of you, this sort of connection between gesture and learning may not seem like a central point, but in the field that some of us, at least here today, are in or related to, second language acquisition, okay, this is a serious problem. We have a serious problem, and that is that acquisition is seen primarily as an isolated cognitive process, as something that happens, if not totally, largely in the head of the learner. And of course, I would never want to deny that heads are deeply involved in language learning. But if we radically separate language learning from the rest of human activity, we ignore culture, largely or completely, as well as the ultimate sociality of language, since communication for social cooperation is what language is primarily for, I would claim, okay? So second language learning becomes far less mysterious and far more natural when we see it as a natural property of being a social animal which needs to continually adjust to its environment. To this end, I've been supporting for some years what is called a sociocognitive approach to second language acquisition, one that sees the social and the cognitive as a single integrated system rather than as, two different kinds of activities. And, this seems so obvious to me. I'd be happy to debate it, but that, what else how else can the social and the cognitive relate, really? Why do we think and learn if not to survive? And how has our species survived over this 1.8 million year period, if not through intense sociocognitive collaboration? Okay, let me turn now to the second part of the Boasian equation, the second main influence that Boas and his students contributed, okay? The idea of cultures, okay? And this, of course, is what this conference, I believe, is primarily about, the idea that social groups develop distinctive identities and social practices, and that our job as teachers is to help students to understand these identities and practices and engage meaningfully with them, okay? So, and I'd like to make four fairly brief points here before I move on to talk about intercultural competence. And these points are closely related. You might think of them as each being an elaboration on the previous one in a sense. First, the social science concept of culture has always been a dangerous idea, okay? And it continues to be a dangerous idea to the point that we debate it and question it and find it insufficient or generative or something that we can talk about and perhaps even develop new ways of thinking from, okay? This is not a concept that's static or still or dead in the water, okay? As I mentioned earlier, it was developed explicitly to counter racist and ethnocentric ideologies, and one mark of its usefulness today is that it continues to trouble racist ideologies. So when we hear, you know, what do I want to call them? You know, negative comments about multiculturalism, or we engage in some kind of culture war, or we hear politicians literally screaming about the inherent violence of Islamic culture, okay, we're hearing the sound of the culture concept doing its work, okay? It's provoking, it's troubling, it's educating, it's not letting racism rest easy. And I certainly can say I, for one, would never want this concept to become domesticated, and if it's in any danger of becoming domesticated in your work or my work, I'd say we will lose its potential as a powerful, dangerous idea. Second, and completely ironically, based on what I've just said, you know, fairly strong arguments have been made that the culture concept is itself essentialist and even racist, okay? So culture in this view, of course, is a Western colonial invention designed to put people into categories of otherness, right? So if you're Japanese and you're polite, you're reserved, you can't say no, you're hierarchical, you're detail-oriented, simply because that's how you were brought up and educated. Some have also charged that culture is a covert tool for racial coding, that because we can't talk about race anymore, we therefore rely on this sort of concept of culture, right? So in rejecting the biological basis of race, the argument goes culture reinscribes it as an object and uses it to other those we see as different from us in some way, just as we did with race, just as we did with biology. Third, part of the problem, obviously, and I think we know this well, with the culture concept is a certain amount of movement that was made in its history from describing small-scale, often local social groups like the Native American tribes that Boaz studied, okay, to describing whole nations and peoples. So Boaz's later students themselves were largely responsible for this shift. Sapir's 1924 essay entitled Cultures Genuine and Spurious is an early example, and Ruth Benedict's Chrysanthemum and the Sword, written during World War II about Japan, is a later one. Now, it seems obvious to me, at any rate, that national cultures are not merely figments of a colonial imagination, even if they are simply imagined communities that, for example, that Benedict Anderson described, where we're American, for instance, because we think we're American, even though we may have probably not much more in common than exposure to the same mass media, which tells us that we are American, and that kind of thing. So, you know, people will build bonds basically on virtually anything, including nationality. It's a pretty powerful one, and these bonds, these identities, are what's most important for a creature that's this group-oriented and this interdependent. Fourth and finally, various and repeated efforts have been made to scale down the culture concept to make it less of a blunt instrument for capturing human difference. So in my own field, applied linguistics, there's been an interesting attempt. One of the interesting attempts is the concept of small cultures by Adrian Holiday. And this concept takes the notion of culture, I would say, halfway back to its Boasian roots. Small cultures form virtually anywhere people engage in recurring group activity, conventional behavior being absolutely crucial if groups are to function as groups. So Holliday proposes that we look at classroom cultures, cultures of the individual classroom, educational cultures, sometimes called cultures of learning, professional academic cultures like those of academic departments or fields and disciplines, or student cultures. Student cultures also being overlapping with youth culture. And he says, let's look at these instead of national culture. Okay, he believes that looking at culture as small culture should supersede this sort of big cultural national culture approach. But even without going that far, I think the concept of small cultures can help us to envision what's happening in our classrooms, what's happening in our schools, what's happening in our academic conferences in different and profitable ways. Okay, finally, let me turn then to talking about, or in the area of, anyway, intercultural competence in classroom instruction. And I don't think I'm terribly well qualified to talk about these, so I'll be rather brief and speculative. Okay. So first, there's a simplifying idea that I sometimes have when I read about IC and see it enacted in the classroom. Okay, this is the idea I got from Stephen Krashen long ago when I was a graduate student with Beatrice. I would say we are both Krashenites in different ways, or were. I will always be, personally. And here was the argument. Krashen said that his own approach to teaching second and foreign languages holds that the only purpose for teaching them is to get students to a point where they can go it on their own, okay? Where they could start to communicate with people well enough to set the stage for the rest of language acquisition to happen naturally by whatever course the learner, wherever the learner wants to take it, right? Perhaps the same could be said about culture teaching, which of course in best practices and intercultural competence is integrated with language teaching. Now I understand this idea is too simple, okay? Much is of course done in and around classrooms to raise intercultural competence beyond sort of minimum threshold, as has been demonstrated well in this conference. But I also think Krashen's ideas, the idea here has some grain of truth to it. Whatever we can do that leads to more exposure and culture learning in situ, okay, and for the specific purposes of the learner, of course, is something that we want to encourage. And culture learning at the level of socialization rather than the level simply of declarative knowledge, of course, has powerful consequences. So this is the form of life version of culture learning rather than the form of knowledge version. Obviously, we need both. Second, there's a conventional belief in some quarters, including some academic quarters, that the most intense forms of socialization are its primary forms, those that we engage in childhood, and that it's basically all downhill after that. Secondary forms of socialization is seen, for example, in sports activities, online gaming, academic cultures, and the military, just for a few examples, are obviously extremely intense, just as intense as any kind of deep immersion in a different kind of more traditional second culture context. So I wonder what we can learn from the most intense secondary socialization experiences that are beyond the classroom that will help us to design our intercultural classrooms. I found Frank Smith's writing on literacy club membership, if you're familiar with that, very useful in thinking about this further. Likewise, James G's work on internet gaming. Third, finally, and by way of concluding my talk, I'd like to return to this idea of one universal human culture. The idea that biologically ordained nature versus socially constructed culture. Okay. Now, this is an old idea, and I think it's inscribed in most of the approaches to culture that we work with still today, the nature versus culture sort of dichotomy. But it seems to me, based on the research that's been done in a number of fields, that these two domains cannot be separated in this way anymore, given what we're learning about human nature. So humans are built to learn, they're built to adapt, they're built to collaborate. We could say they're built to be cultural. Okay, all of these are cultural activities as well. Practically everything we've done to this point in our evolutionary history, all of our cultural inventions and practices are based on our common shared ability to build culture. So to end on a quite speculative note, perhaps it might advantage us to focus on how much we share and how we build on and increase that level of sharedness in our intercultural teaching and research. This, of course, would be in addition to and not a replacement of viewing cultures purely by comparison and contrast, contrasting and comparing culture one and culture two. It's certainly the basis, this common human cultural nature, shall we call it, is certainly the basis for how we learn, how we adapt, and how we're able to cross cultural boundaries. I wonder if it might not have a larger place in the intercultural classroom as well. Thank you.